I know people are tired of seeing chat app examples built with SignalR. However, this is a chat app example built with SignalR. Consider it an initiation application into SignalR development. So if you've never built anything with SignalR before, watch this video. Otherwise, you can skip it if you think you know it all. We're also going to be covering a couple of ideas and decisions made in building this application. Let's go ahead and have a quick overview. We're again going to start with the startup. I have authentication. I've already explained how authentication works with SignalR. I'm adding the regular cookie authentication. I then have this following middleware. I have SignalR and controllers, the user ID provider, and chat registry. Chat registry is just an in-memory database. Okay, so this can be replaced with your DB context or whatever other database that you're using. Then we have the endpoints. I have the chat hub and I have map default controllers. The only controller I have is the default controller over here, where we have the authentication endpoint, where we authenticate with the cookie. The rest I'm not going to explain. We are calling an endpoint to create a room, and we have an endpoint to list rooms. We then have the chat hub. So let's take a look at that. Chat hub. Here we have, again, the chat registry. So we're injecting the database. We have the join room function here, and we have the leave room function here. We also have the send message function here as well. As for the models, like the input message, the room request, you can find those in the models file here, and there will be a bunch of records here. So you have the user record, which is just user ID and the username. Room request, which you're making some kind of request and you're just bringing the room with you. Input message, so this is what we receive from the client. Output message, this is what we distribute. Because once we're on the backend, we are aware of the user context. We know who the user, we know who sent the input message. So then we can construct the user message, and then if we are outputting anything, we can output the message. Okay, so these are the models. Feel free to go through them. But the main things are on the join room. When we add the user to the groups, this is going to be called with invoke, and we return all the messages that were in this room, right? So we want to see the chat history. We return the messages, call this with invoke. Otherwise, things like leave room can be called with send, okay? Then the send message, so we will receive an input message, we will read the username, and then when we're constructing the user message, we are essentially loading the user information from the cookie that is attached. And notice that we have the authorize attribute. So a decision can be made here with the input message, so the stuff that's being sent from the client. Do you want to include the user information on here, or do you want to read it in on the backend from the cookie that is attached? So this is an important decision, and if you include it in this message, that means somebody can send whatever they want, and then you're going to have validation rather than already having the username with the cookie and kind of extracting it from there. Okay, so just be wary of sending session-specific things in messages that only could be created during that session, right? So we have an authentication session, and during that authentication session, we're sending messages. So the messages are kind of wrapped by the authentication. So you don't want the client to extract the information from the session and put it on the message. And you don't want to do things like having a controller get user information, send the user information to the client, and then keep that state and include that state, query that state every single time and put it onto the input message and then read it, okay? The cookie is sent with every request. Get the state from there, and this is how we do it. May not be obvious, but take this as an important point in general application design. Next thing is we register a message, right? So we're just keeping track of all the messages, and then we're having group accept. In the feature overview video, I mentioned that you can be very specific about who you're sending messages to, and this is just an example of that. We want to send a message to the group except the user who's sending the message, because that can be handled on the JavaScript side. When I said you can greatly configure who you send messages to, check out all the functions that exist on the hub. So be it all clients or client or group, there are methods there that will probably serve your use case. Otherwise, what you're gonna have to do, if you cannot control who you're sending the message to through SignalR, you will have to have your user object, so this one right here, keep track of the connection ID here, and through your own logic, figure out who you want to send things to. Otherwise, SignalR should pretty much cover all of your use cases. Here we take the user message and we trigger output, which just creates a new output message from the user message. And that's pretty much on that side. We already know what user ID provider is, and let's take a look at the index.html. We're creating a connection. We are not connecting unless we are actually joining a room over here. We can authenticate, we can send a message, we can create a room. Notice that create is just a regular fetch. List is also a regular fetch. Join, we start the connection. Once we have connection, we are invoking join room. So we're getting our history back. We log the history. We store the current room so we can leave it later. And then we send messages. And then we subscribe to send messages, which just means we are just going to console log them. With the leave, we are sending leave room. So as I mentioned before, we don't need to know the result of our leaving group. As soon as we sort of ping that leave room message, what we're doing is we're clearing the current room, we are using connection of send message, and then we are stopping the connection. We don't need the connection, no messages are going to be received. If you have multiple rooms, you might have to reconsider this option and have the connection start at the beginning, okay? Otherwise, being able to be only in one room, I'm going to only create and stop the connection once I'm joining or leaving the room. One thing I've decided to leave here is this connection off. So the reason I'm using connection off and just the send message is I want to make a point about these two Lambda functions. They're not the same because you create value once and then you create a second value. These are two different values. These are two different references. If you would have your console log message as a parameter here, so const console log message as a function that does something like this, then you want to be using, or rather can be using, toggle off this specific function, because then the reference is the same and then it's actually going to unbind an event, okay? If you have two separate functions like this, here and here, when you call off, it's not actually going to unbind this function because the reference to this function is different. So if you want to unbind this function or any other functions that are hooked into this event, you have to call off on this event, all right? Or use the specific function reference. So in this case, I am just using turn off all events rather than this specific one, okay? So not a very complicated chat application, very minimal. I tried to, again, just have no UI. We're gonna have examples with UI, don't worry. Just to reiterate, default controller is authorized. The only allow anonymous is authenticate endpoint, so we can authenticate. And then we have the chat hub authorized as well. Okay, so we will not be able to connect and we will not be able to do anything unless we're authenticated, which is what happens here. Okay, so let's bring up the browsers. I have two separate browsing sessions. Let me go ahead and pretty sure I was testing this before. So yep, here I have some cookies. What I'm gonna do, I'm just gonna clear them and I'm gonna clear them here. I'm going to come back to the console, just going to refresh this, and then we can try to join some kind of room. We're going to get a 401. If we try to go ahead and list the rooms, we're going to get a 404. The 404 here is essentially a redirect to the login page. You can disable this by sending some specific headers. I'm not going to cover those headers here because, I mean, that's out of scope, okay? You can Google the answer to that if you don't want to get redirected on 401s when using the Fetch API or Axios or any other asynchronous JavaScript. Nevertheless, let's go ahead and authenticate. I'm going to create a user Bob. Again, the source code is available. Everything is in the description. So if I'm not going to be covering every code because that's going to get very old very quickly. So if you want to be reminded of what this does, pull the code down. We're going to create a room. So we're going to create room 1. We can then list them and then we have the room. We can also create Bob room again. Pretty standard stuff. This is not, what's it called? This is not really SignalR. So let's go ahead and join a room. We're going to join room 1. And there we go. So we have message history here. We can do things like send 1, and then 2, and then 3. So here are some messages. Notice that because we have the groups accept method, we're only sending it to other users, not to ourselves, because we already have the message that we're sending here. We can put that in the chat, no problem. On this side, let's go ahead and authenticate as well. We will say evil twin user. Again, we can list the rooms and then we can join a room. So we are in room 1. We can join a room, room 1. There we have the message history. So 1, 2, 3, Bob is saying it. We can go ahead and reply with a message. Hi. And then you can see the messages popping up on this side, not on this side. We can do things like leave the room, again, list, and then join Bob's room because, you know, evil Bob is in that room and, you know, message history is empty here. and then it's like, oh no, I need to join the other room, wherever that was, join room 1 again, and you have the whole message history here. So again, not a very complicated chat application. One thing that we can also discuss is a design choice that you could probably face is, when do you use fetch and when do you use send or invoke? So when do you use controllers? Because I'm using a mix here, and there is a balance that you can strike here. So let's open up default controller and let's open up Chat Hub, and let's create a rule for ourselves. When do we want to use the hub and when do we want to use the controller? Is creating a room a real-time concern, and is listing rooms a real-time concern? Not in my specific implementation. I'm not displaying anything on the UI that a new room has been created, and I'm kind of on a select room menu where if people are creating rooms or deleting rooms, they're kind of popping on and off in this list. If that was the case, I would be creating the connection first thing, and these things would be in the chat hub. Currently, as it stands, these things do not depend on the real-time aspect of it, and these things do. So joining a room and leaving the room, they do not necessarily provide the real-time aspect. However, the connection ID holds the same principle as the authentication session. So we have a session and then we have state inside that session. Okay, so here we have the authentication session. With the context, we have the real-time connection session. So connection ID is the thing that sits around the room request that we're currently sending. And plus, additionally, when somebody joins the room or leaves the room, this is something that we can display. Is this user in the room or not? Similar to if we had a room lobby component. We will be creating rooms and relisting rooms every time we would create a room, or if a room would be deleted, we would be again re-rendering the list of rooms. To summarize, two things related to real-time communication. First thing is the context connection ID may not necessarily relate to the real-time connection. However, it's related to the framework and this rule where I said you have a session wrapping the actual message that you're sending. Okay, allowing this to be sent in the controller as a parameter, basically allows the user to do whatever they want and send a connection ID that doesn't belong to them, and then you're going to have to do validation. So context connection ID is the session. If we have a session, let's rely on that session rather than passing it in the controller. Second is the real-time aspect. So for create room and list room, we don't really need to update anybody about these things being created. If we do, we put them in the hub. If it's a real-time concern, like joining the room, leaving a room, and sending messages, we put it in the hub. If we're relying on the SignalR connection session, or it's a real-time concern, it goes in the hub. There are going to be situations where it's not going to be possible, so you're going to have to work around, but try to keep those to the hub. This will be it for this example. Thank you very much for watching. There will be more to come. If you have any questions, ask them in the comment section or on my Discord server. Hope you're enjoying the series. Have a good day.